Today's video is brought to you by Ground News. Stay tuned to find out how you can get 30% off unlimited access to Ground News. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a J. Warner Wallace video called 5 Responses to Common Christian Objections, which I assume is actually going to be responses to objections to Christianity rather than Christian objections, but we can cut him some slack for a technically incorrect title. After all, it's not like he's built his whole brand on the idea that he's good enough at paying attention to detail to be able to solve a 2,000-year-old cold case, am I right? Let's see what this is all about. But first, do you trust the media to provide you with an accurate framing of the story that you're reading? The answer is probably no, so I've got a solution for you. Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Their website and app provides you with a complete picture of every story. By scrolling or swiping through, we can compare articles from thousands of publications and see the political bias, ownership, and factuality of those sources. You've got to see this website to believe it. You can use Ground News to get a thorough accounting of the facts and make an informed decision independent of the inherent biases of the reporting outlets. I am a long-time user of Ground News. In fact, Ground News was the very first sponsor that I ever had for my channel, and I highly recommend the product. I use Ground News when I'm preparing for Twit Tweets so I can get a handle on how well the stories I want to talk about are being covered by various news outlets. Ground News makes my job on Twit Tweets so much easier by allowing me to customize my feed, giving me a personalized dashboard that lets me filter news articles by topics of interest instead of just leaving me reliant on the whims of social media virality to bring me the stories that are relevant to me. They even have a blind spot section where you can check out news items that are only being covered by one side of the political spectrum to see how it's being covered. Become a smarter news consumer by gaining a deeper understanding of the complexity and nuance of different issues by identifying media narratives. You'll also develop a well-rounded worldview and see every side of every story with access to international perspectives that can be hard to find otherwise. Subscribe to Ground News today by going to ground.news/ViceRhino to get the full side of every story. Subscribe through my link before September 1st and get 30% off unlimited access. That's ground.news/VICEDRHINO to get 30% off. And on top of that, you'll be supporting my channel. Thank you.
I do hold outlines for several key objections, and sometimes those outlines are just my own refresher course of how I first overcame the objection when I held it, because I held these objections myself for 35 years as an atheist.
To paraphrase, I'm going to give you some thought-stopping sound bites to throw out there when you hear these objections. Combined, of course, with a not-so-subtle reference to his whole "I was an atheist until I used my cold case skills to solve the case of Jesus." Which, now that I think about it, what was he even solving there? As a homicide detective, even if his expertise were relevant to solving anything from 2,000 years ago, what is he solving? The murder of Jesus? The Romans did it. There, solved, and that solution doesn't make me a Christian. The disappearance of his body, maybe? Well, how is cold case homicide work relevant to that question? But also, step 1 of solving a homicide, cold case or otherwise, is to lay out a timeline of events leading up to and immediately following the homicide. So if we use this very basic skill of detective work on Wallace himself, we find that he was born in 1961 and became a Christian at the age of 35, according to his biography on coldcasechristianity.com. That would put his conversion in 1996. But according to a commendation that he received in 2012, he wasn't put on cold case work until 2007, 11 years after he became a Christian. And the oldest cold case for which there is any sort of verification that Wallace actually worked on it was opened in the year 2000, 4 years after he became a Christian. So even if he worked on that cold case before he was officially made a cold case detective, that still doesn't fit his story of using his cold case experience to solve the case of Jesus. Prophet of Zod actually did the detective work to solve this particular case, and he has a great video on just how sketchy Wallace's story is. So I'll leave a card to that video. I highly recommend it.
We're in a culture right now, an information age, and it's really kind of a misnomer in some ways. It's not just that we're just in an information age. We're in an incredibly concise information age, impatient information age. The impatient information age we're in only allows you so much time to make the case. In other words, if people are Googling for an answer and they've got a choice between a 1,000-word response and a 10,000-word response, a 100-word response and a 1,000-word response, they are almost always going to default to the shorter response.
My favorite thing here is that he's saying this in a 22-minute video that purports to give short answers to these objections. Like, yeah, I'm not the most concise person in the world myself, I am aware of that, but nowhere in my videos will you find me saying that I am giving you advice on how to say the same thing as me, but in a soundbite form. Now, that said, usually the reason my videos are long is because I try to be as accurate as I can be, and that often includes the need for a bunch of technical caveats that cover as many bases as I can in one go. I try to avoid repeating myself in videos, and I often skip large segments of other people's videos where they do essentially just repeat themselves. I've already skipped about 1 minute and 15 seconds of Wallace's video. I mentioned this because this guy just took 2 minutes to say, in this video I will give you concise versions of the apologetics that convince me to become a Christian, so that you are equipped to have those conversations even when your time and character count are limited. There, I just condensed 2 minutes of his video down to about 10 seconds.
So it's really important for us to be able to make a case briefly, because the rest of the world is making it briefly. As a matter of fact, I think that those who oppose Christianity have done a good job of understanding and crafting objections in 140 characters.
Yeah, it's important to be brief because the atheists are good at being brief. My video catalog sure is proof of that. Remember the good old days when I started my channel and if a video was longer than 15 minutes I would call it too long and split it into multiple parts? And for what it's worth, I get way more complaints when I upload too many videos in a row that are under a half hour, saying that they missed the long form videos, than I do complaints that my videos are too long when they start hitting the 45 to 50 minute mark. He rants on for a bit about how attention spans seem to be getting shorter on average, which is a dubious claim that is usually cited as coming from a 2015 report by the Consumer Insights team at Microsoft, saying that the average attention span declined from 12 seconds in 2000 to just over 8 seconds in 2015. It usually goes along with a comparison to a goldfish. But Microsoft was not actually the source for those numbers. They cited the Statistic Brain Research Institute, which in turn cited the National Center for Biotechnology Information and the Associated Press, but not specifically enough to find any of the actual research that came to that conclusion. Now, conversely, when looking into this claim, the only source that I could find that comes to the conclusion that the shortening attention span thing is a myth is a BBC News article, and other articles that refer back to that one. The only authoritative source that keeps coming up is psychologist Dr. Gemma Briggs, but not with any research citations, just that in her opinion, attention spans just don't work that way. They are largely task-dependent. Your attention span for something is determined by a combination of what that thing is and how you go about interacting with that thing. So, for example, I might be able to spend 10 minutes doing the dishes by themselves, but if I'm listening to a podcast while doing them, then maybe I'll be able to pay attention to them for 20 minutes or so. Also, I would have a hard time just sitting there listening to a podcast. I stop paying attention. I have to be doing something else while doing it, such as doing the dishes, or playing a time waster game on my phone, or something along those lines, and that will greatly increase my attention span for listening to the podcast. Now, this being said that there's only the one source that counters this claim, when you do look into various research on attention spans, the evidence for attention spans of specific lengths of time is tenuous, and the evidence for shortening attention spans over time is non-existent. It is generally assumed that the attention span for watching a lecture is between 10 to 15 minutes. Of the 10 videos of mine with the best performance in the last year, the average view duration went anywhere from 15 minutes and 12 seconds on the low end to 51 minutes and 18 seconds on the high end, averaging about 26 minutes. Of course, I can't say for certain that the people watching these videos were actually paying attention the entire time, so this isn't exactly bulletproof, but it does seem like the amount of time someone pays attention to my video is more of a function of the length of the video itself, rather than it regressing to the mean of some number of minutes, with people generally watching around half the video. The two main outliers in the top 10 are videos that are significantly longer than my usual videos, because they were multiple videos combined into one. One was over 3 hours long, and the other is close to 2 hours long. But while those were outliers as far as how much of the video people watch as a percentage, they were the two highest in absolute number of minutes watched. So yeah, all this to say that he complains about a phenomenon that is not evident in order to explain why brevity is important. And if you made it through my whole explanation and are now hearing me say this, then you're kind of disproving him right there.
The first claim, the first objection I want to cover is perhaps one of the most simple objections, and maybe one of the most common. That's why it's a good place for us to start. And that is the simple question, who created God?
I have mixed feelings about this one. It's highly context-dependent, as in it only works as an objection to certain specific formulations of the cosmological argument, and they're ones that you don't see very often nowadays. Ones like Aquinas' prime mover argument, which doesn't usually see the light of day anymore since Newton's laws of motion basically refuted it. Essentially, it was, whatever is in motion must be moved by something else. Infinite regresses are impossible, therefore there must be an unmoved mover, or prime mover, that set things in motion. Newton's laws refute this because it leaves us with the question of why could there not just always have been motion? Why is no motion the default state? That which is in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force, and that which is at rest remains at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. So if there has just always been motion, there's no need to explain where it comes from. But setting that aside and agreeing hypothetically that motion requires a mover, that means that in order for God to move, he needs to have been moved himself, which then sends us back to the infinite regress. But even here, I don't particularly care for this line of argumentation. It's not so much that it's an invalid question in and of itself, it's more that I find it to be an easy question for an apologist to dismiss offhand. Instead, I prefer to ask, why is it that the logic that applies to things in the universe and to the universe as a whole does not also apply to God? If everything that moves needs to have been moved, why does God not need to have been moved? Because of special pleading, that's why. Later versions of the cosmological argument were rephrased to eliminate the special pleading, but it's still there. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. God didn't begin to exist, therefore he doesn't need a cause, and asking what caused God is nonsensical, QED. And I agree. Asking what caused God in response to this formulation of the argument is unhelpful at best. What is interesting is how far you have to water down the argument to get around the what caused God or why doesn't the logic that God is to God also apply to God problems. In order to avoid them, you essentially have to take God out of the conclusion. The universe needs a cause. Great. The universe had a cause. We agree. Nothing in this argument says that the cause has to be a god, and it doesn't even get us close to that god being the God of the Bible.
It's really an argument that attempts to take one step back before the Creator. It's almost as if the atheist is saying, look, we're all looking for this cause, but you guys have created a cause that can't be the ultimate necessary cause, because the question could always be asked, who created your cause of the universe? What caused your cause of the universe?
Yeah, I guess, but the atheist is likely to leave off the qualifiers necessary and ultimate when talking about the cause of the universe, because we recognize that such qualifiers are assumptions. We don't know that there is a necessary or ultimate cause. Those are just things that are asserted by these arguments without having anything to back them up.
So the objection really is foundationally about causes, right? And what kind of cause might best account for the universe we are in, the caused universe we are in?
Sorta, yeah, but really it's more about the fact that we don't have enough information at this time to conclude much of anything about the cause of the universe. We know that the Big Bang happened, but anything before that is a matter of mostly speculation at this point. Though it does bear mentioning that there are significant differences between the different kinds of speculation on this subject. On the one hand, you have cosmologists who are working mathematically within our understanding of the laws of physics without assuming anything about the nature of the cause, trying to come up with explanations that are consistent with our understanding of just how stuff works. And on the other hand, you have apologists asserting what essentially amounts to, we don't understand it, therefore it must have been God. They'll dress it up in sophistry to make it sound like that's not what they're saying, but when you scratch a cosmological argument, it bleeds the God of the gaps.
And so when I answer this question, I have a certain structure in my mind. I think there are really 2 points I ultimately want to use or want to bring up in my response. And I want to make sure I either connect these 2 points in some way, or at least make sure I get to these 2 points. The first is kind of a simple, actually a term of English, actually, a rhetorical response that is really about how we use language and definitions. Think about this for a minute. We would say that the classic definition of God is that God, and this is true of every theistic system, that God is the necessary being. In other words, God is the uncreated creator of the universe.
In other words, you define God as being the cause of the universe, and since the universe both exists and appears to have had a beginning, God then must also exist. But even if I grant that, that leaves the door wide open for something that might turn out to be a completely naturalistic phenomenon, winding up being God definitionally. So that sort of definition game doesn't seem like it would be helpful to anyone.
So when someone asks the question, who created God, what they're really asking us, if we were to take the definition of God that we hold and exchange it for the word God in that sentence, it would sound something like this. Mr. Christian, who created the uncreated creator of the universe?
And that's why I don't like that question in general. It makes it too easy to escape using these word games. Much better to ask, how do you know God was uncreated? Why doesn't the logic that gets us to a universe that was created also apply to God? Sure, they'll still get out of it by appealing to their definition of a god, but they'll have to put a bit more work into it than just a rephrasing of the question to sound more ridiculous.
Now we're just taking the definition, the uncreated creator of the universe, and put that in instead of the word God, and you can see now how silly that question really is, right?
No, you're just escaping it through an assertion rather than by examining evidence or even just using logical argumentation. That is just as valid as if I defined the universe as an uncreated space that contains everything. Well, now there's no God according to your definition of God. And for all we know, my definition of the universe is correct. Our knowledge of the origin of the universe only goes back to the Big Bang. Every idea we have for what might have happened prior to the Big Bang is hypothetical, working within the framework of theoretical physics. There are cosmological models that would work with my definition of the universe, such as the bouncing cosmology model and the Carroll-Chen model. But would you accept that definition for the word universe? Or would you maybe question my reasoning for sneaking the word uncreated into the definition as though it were a given? Whatever your reasoning for not liking that definition applies equally to your definition of God.
But here's the second point. I think it's just as powerful. We aren't the only ones, as theists, who believe in something uncreated.
How exactly is that powerful? That seems like more of a, well, duh kind of statement to me. Yes, I am aware that if I don't believe in a creator, that I then believe that the universe was not created. That's kind of my whole shtick here. I don't think a creator is a necessary part of the explanation for the universe, and since cosmologists don't appeal to a god when working out their models of how the universe came to be, to me, this says that the foremost experts on the origin of the universe also don't think that a creator is a necessary part of the explanation for the universe. The difference here is that they don't just assert that uncreated is a quality that the universe has by definition, as you do with God.
As a matter of fact, as I was writing the book God's Crime Scene, I found myself at several points reading the work of astrophysicists, and not just the kind of, not Christian astrophysicists, because the vast number of astrophysicists are atheists, and so I'm reading all of them.
Wallace, please, take a moment to think about what you just said. When writing a book with the goal of proving the existence of God, you found yourself reading the writings of a bunch of astrophysicists. And these people, who are the experts on how the universe operates, are mostly atheists. And somehow you are going to turn their work into evidence to support the existence of a god? Which is more likely here? That all of the experts in a specific field of study are wrong about it, or that you, a layman, are misinterpreting, misunderstanding, or drawing unjustified conclusions from their work? I know where I'd put my money here, and it ain't on the detective. This might come as a shock to Wallace fans, but as it turns out, being a detective doesn't even come close to qualifying you to speak authoritatively on astrophysics. I'm skipping ahead now. When we come back to him, he's giving a botched explanation of Krauss's universe from nothing hypothesis, because of course he is. That's the only model that apologists seem capable of even acknowledging, but that's where we are when we get back.
Well, if I asked you what caused the quantum vacuum, that astrophysicist is likely to say that that vacuum was itself eternal.
And that's how I can tell that you haven't actually read much in the way of astrophysics or cosmology. Either that or you didn't read it carefully with the purpose of actually coming to understand it, but were instead reading it superficially with the purpose of finding talking points you could use to support your conclusion in your book. Because if you actually ask that question, you're more likely to get an answer along the lines of, it is eternal in the sense that it existed for as long as time has existed, or eternal isn't an applicable term when there is no time. In the case of the Hartle-Hawking model, the universe itself is eternal since time gives way to space at the beginning of the Big Bang, leaving us with space that has no initial boundaries, but time having existed for about 13.7 billion years.
Everyone does that. Not just Christians, not just theists, atheists also have to answer the same question. So to raise this question as an objection to theism or as an objection to Christianity doesn't really work unless you're willing to allow me to raise it against your worldview.
And why wouldn't you be able to do that? The difference here is that cosmologists are saying, we don't know, so here are some ideas that are consistent with how we know the universe operates, while apologists are saying, we don't know, so God did it. The cosmologist isn't afraid of asking these questions, though with regards to some models, they are completely nonsensical questions. But again, that's not because the cosmologist asserts that their idea is for sure the ultimate cause of the universe and there's no room for anything else. It's more that if this model turns out to be accurate, then there's no need for anything else to explain everything.
All of us have this problem. So the question itself becomes impotent in its ability to knock down a worldview, because if it's going to knock down one worldview, it unfortunately will knock down every worldview.
Only if you miss the point of asking the question in the first place. It's not about actually answering the question of what created God. It's about pointing out that the apologetics and theological argumentation that get you to a God are insufficient. They either don't explain why the logic that gets you to a God doesn't also apply to God, or else they try to escape this problem by defining it away. But here's a fun fact for you. The universe does not cater to human definitions. Just because you defined God into existence doesn't mean that God actually exists.
So this question is really nonsensical and unnecessary, but the better question is, what do we think is the uncaused first cause? Because all of us are looking for that.
Yeah, but some of us are doing it scientifically, while others are asserting that they already know. Now, I thought about skipping this next part, but just to support my earlier claim that Wallace doesn't know how to be concise in this video that purports to teach you how to be concise, let's hear him give his response in what he calls the shortest possible way.
Let's try to offer this in the shortest possible explanation. For somebody who would say, well, who created God? I would say, well, look, first of all, by definition, we believe, and all theists believe, that the definition of God is that he is the uncreated creator of the universe. So when you ask this question, who created the uncreated creator of the universe, it's kind of like you're asking a question that already has an answer. It's in the definition of God. But let's just put that aside for a second. Remember that all of us are looking for the same uncreated first cause of the universe. This is no different from me as a theist as it is from my atheist friends. My atheist friends would argue this is some kind of multiverse generator or quantum environment, some type of eternal cause that causes, by the way, we're both doing this, we're both looking for an uncaused first cause, because we know if we don't have an uncaused first cause, we have kind of an infinite regress problem, right? We could always ask, well, who created that? Then who created that? And who created that? So in the end, I'm no different as a theist than my atheist friends. We're all looking for the uncaused first cause. That's why a question like who created God really is nonsensical. It has no power to destroy theism, and it has no power to affirm theism, because all of us, regardless of worldview, have to answer the exact same question.
Let's see if we can do better. God is the uncreated creator, so to ask who created the uncreated creator is nonsensical. No matter what you believe, the universe has a cause that was not created, and we're all looking for this cause. There, we got it down from 1 minute and 10 seconds to just under 15 seconds.
Now there I've offered an answer for you in less than 60 seconds.
Not to be too nitpicky here, but 70 seconds is more than 60 seconds, not less. You should try repeating yourself less frequently. Bonus, mine fits into a tweet. Or an X, I guess, now. You heard it here first, folks. Mine fits inside an X. Whose X? Never you mind.
The objection is, I can't believe in God because I have too many unanswered questions.
See, now this is a tricky one, because I'm betting that he's going to try and take this and make it seem like it's a flipped around God of the Gap style argument. But in reality, the way I would use this one would be more along the lines of asking questions whose answers, or lack thereof, end up putting some pretty significant flaws that Christianity has on display. For instance, why do I need to believe in Jesus in order to have my sins forgiven, when God in the Old Testament forgives sins without any sacrifices on multiple occasions? In 2 Chronicles 7:14, he will forgive sins in exchange for people humbling themselves, praying, seeking his face, and turning from their wicked ways. No sacrifice, just behave like better people. And in Isaiah 43:24-25, we have an example of God forgiving people's sins not only without any sort of sacrifice, but even without them repenting. You have not bought me sweet cane with money or satisfied me with the fat of your sacrifices, but you have burdened me with your sins. You have wearied me with your iniquities. I am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake, and I will not remember your sins. So God has the ability to forgive sins without there being any kind of sacrifice first, even for people who are unrepentant. So why can he not do what so many other religions have done and judge people based on their actions and intentions in this life, rather than just on an arbitrary "do you believe in Jesus"? The whole "any sin is bad enough to condemn you to hell and you cannot earn your way into heaven through good actions" thing doesn't really work once you realize that God is able to forgive people without a sacrifice first if he wants to. So why punish otherwise good people for the crime of not accepting a sacrifice? This one has the added bonus of making humans appear more loving than God. I love all my children and have forgiven them on many occasions for things that they have said or done to me, often without even requiring them to apologize first. I do this because I love them. What kind of love is it that would require them to jump through a bunch of arbitrary hoops in order to earn my forgiveness? Now, if it were physically impossible for me to forgive them without the hoop jumping for some reason, then my encouraging them to do the hoop jumping could be considered loving. But if I just suddenly, for no apparent reason, decided that I would refuse to forgive them without the hoop jumping, that would not be loving. So, given this information, God is not loving. Anyway, I actually made a 10 questions for Christian style video a couple of years ago that goes into more detail about some of these questions and why they're not only unanswered, but unanswerable. Not so much that the answers haven't been attempted, but that those answers either don't make sense or create other bigger problems for Christianity.
In other words, it might come out something like this. Look, you Christians don't even agree on everything. You don't have answers for half the questions. You disagree what the answer might be.
Yeah, that's essentially question 7 in my 10 questions video. One would think that if Christianity were actually the one true religion, then the God of Christianity might take some steps to ensure that his followers are all preaching the same message and practicing the same rituals. And indeed, Jesus himself prayed to God that this would be the case in John chapter 17. He prayed that everyone who believes in him and everyone who would come to believe in him would be perfectly unified so that the world may know that Jesus is who he claimed to be. Given that there are roughly 45,000 denominations of Christianity, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if perfect unification would show the world that Jesus is God, such massive disunification serves to show the world that Jesus is not God.
You've got a lot of open questions. How do I reconcile, for example, the sovereignty of God with the free agency of humans?
Yep, that one gets touched on in several of my 10 questions. The idea that God not only knows everything that ever has and ever will happen, but also that he is the being who created everything. If you have such perfect knowledge of the past and future, and you also are the being who created everything with full knowledge of all the downstream consequences of every single one of your creative decisions, then it is logically impossible for free will to exist. So either God does not have perfect knowledge of all events past and future, or he is not the creator. Either that or free will is an illusion and we're all just puppets playing out God's plan on a stage for him, with him controlling all the puppets?
How do I reconcile other questions? Like, what is the exact mechanism by which God creates? What does that look like?
Well, that one is a perfectly reasonable question to ask in response to a creationist complaining that we don't know the details of the origin of the universe or life or some other such thing. The response is that they don't know the details either. They just sub in God for anything that is currently unknown without even attempting to explain any of the mechanisms of how God did anything. The point of that question is to point out that God did it is not actually an answer to a question. It's basically just another thought stopper.
I at least want to acknowledge to my atheist friends that, yeah, it does appear that we have some open questions. And it appears that I'm not going to be able, probably in this lifetime, to get answers to those questions. So then the issue becomes, well, okay, so how can you believe in a worldview in which you have open, unanswered questions?
Yep, there we go, suspicion confirmed. No, the problem with these questions is not that you have a worldview with unanswered questions. I also have a worldview with unanswered questions, as I'm sure you're about to point out. The problem is that many of these questions are ones that, if your worldview were actually correct, would have clear answers that we are capable of understanding, or else they would have different answers than they so clearly do. Having an unknown is okay. Having questions that are unanswerable because of internal inconsistencies within your worldview is not the same thing as having an unknown.
That's the nature of the objection. Can you see it, why it's so powerful?
The way you phrased it? No, absolutely not. It is not powerful. But such is the nature of apologetics. Create a straw man of your opponent's argument and then knock it down and marvel at how easy it was to knock down.
I go back to my training as a cold case detective working in a jury setting, and I want to make a couple of quick points. Number one, the first point I want to make is that you don't have to have every question answered in order to know something is true. So that's a point I'm going to have to make.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. For instance, we don't have to know how life originated in order to believe that evolution is true. But creationists will often use our lack of knowledge on the origin of life as evidence against evolution. Same with the Big Bang. We don't know what came before the Big Bang, therefore the Big Bang must not be true, even though it's a theory that has made many testable predictions, several of which have since been observationally verified.
And two, I'm going to want to answer that we do have good enough information to make a decision here.
Again, I agree. Though I doubt very much that we'll continue to agree once you get to what you think that decision should be.
The first thing I'm going to want to ask is do you think you have 100% certainty about anything you think you know in your life?
Irrelevant. I'm not looking for 100% certainty. I'm looking for sufficient evidence to justify belief.
We have to decide and help people understand there's a difference between what's possible and what's reasonable. I can have possible doubts, yet still convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt because I don't hold a reasonable doubt. I only hold possible doubts. This is very common, right?
Here's the thing, though. Well, firstly, I believe that the doubting of Christianity is quite reasonable, and I explained why in my Proof of Not God video. But secondly, you're using the American legal standard for criminal convictions of beyond a reasonable doubt. But if God is all-powerful, and God wants everyone to know for certain that he exists, why should we lower our bar to reasonable doubt rather than just leaving it at 100% certainty? Is God not capable of proving his own existence to everyone such that they can all be 100% certain that he exists? And since the Bible claims that God wants everyone to believe in him, why would he not give us this proof? God shouldn't need us to lower the bar so that he can meet human standards. He should be able to sail over the highest bar we could ever think up with perfect ease.
Right? We are limited, finite creatures who don't have infinite knowledge. Therefore, we cannot answer every question.
I don't know. That sounds like a design deficiency to me. Maybe God could have designed us with a better capacity for knowledge?
So that's the first thing. Also, as an atheist, I had tons of unanswered questions. As a matter of fact, I've written that entire book, God's Crime Scene, really about the unanswered questions of atheism.
To rephrase, no you! Except in this case, atheists are, for the most part, already aware of the existence of questions with unknown answers. In my experience, atheists are actually much more comfortable with the answer to a question being I don't know than Christians are. It has often been observed that Christians will expect atheists to be experts in astronomy, cosmology, biology, biochemistry, molecular genetics, and several other fields of science in order to justify their non-belief in God. Because while there may be unknowns in those fields of science that the Christians will gleefully point out, they have the answer. God did it. But for some reason, the situation doesn't need to be flipped. It's okay to be a Christian without knowing the ins and outs of these sciences. Just have faith. No Christian will expect a fellow Christian to be able to answer questions that require a detailed knowledge of cosmology in order to justify their Christian faith. But you can't be an atheist unless you know all the details about the origin of the universe. And even the experts who know more than any other human beings in existence on this topic, who Wallace admits are mostly atheists, are told that they shouldn't be atheists because there remain unanswered questions about their work. And laymen like Wallace will gleefully write pop apologetics books using their work to draw conclusions that they will tell you cannot be drawn from their work, because the cold case detective clearly knows more about the origin of the universe than a cosmologist who has spent his entire career doing nothing but studying the origin of the universe.
As an atheist, though, I couldn't tell you how the universe came into existence, why it appears to be fine-tuned, how life can originate from non-life, why it has the appearance of design if there is no designer, how we have consciousness and free agency, and why there are objective, transcendent moral truths and obligations, and why there's a standard that's objective for goodness by which we judge anything and call it evil.
So, yeah, basically what I just said, but add a bunch of philosophy on top of the science. You're not allowed to be an atheist simply because you find the claims of Christianity to be unbelievable, and so don't believe them. You have to be able to justify your non-belief by becoming a polymath. But Christians are fine justifying their belief just by saying, I feel like it's true, without having even a rudimentary understanding of any of those topics.
I can't give you good atheistic, materialistic answers for those big key points. I can't.
You can't give good Christian answers to those questions either. I mean, you can give answers, but the answers are always just, God did it. Why is it acceptable for you to just assert that God did it and call it a good answer, but the atheist answer of, I don't know, why don't we try to find out, isn't good enough for you?
Now, as a theist, I have some open questions too. Lots. But the question really for me is, which worldview gives me the best answers with the least questions?
Well, here's the thing. If the answer to your question is God did it or mysterious ways, then I would count that as a question that is not answered. Since you have all the same unanswered questions as atheists, given that your answer is just God did it, then the fact that you have a bunch of additional unanswered questions such as why does God make people who he knows will end up in hell, with the answers being a bunch of sophistry to hide the fact that there is no answer other than mysterious ways, then that means that atheism wins by that metric. And that's basically it for this one. He does another rambling, short version of this objection, and I'm left wondering how they decided on the title for this video. 5 responses to Christian objections? Well, there were only 2 objections, and he gave 1 response to each, and that was supposed to boil down to a quick 60-second soundbite. I mean, his responses both had 2 parts, so we could get up to 4 responses if we count each of the parts of the responses to be a separate response, but really, this just looks like a desperate attempt to engage in clickbaiting. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Joe Impala Corsi 3693, who says, how come the instant Adam and Eve sinned, all mankind was doomed, yet the instant Jesus was strung up and died, all mankind was not saved? It would have been so simple. The Christian God is strange. That's a good point that I've never really considered before. If original sin affected everybody without them having a choice in the matter, then salvation should apply equally to everybody in the same way. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. And I stream with my partner every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern here. Don't forget to go to ground.news/ViceRhino to get 30% off unlimited access. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Tiago Souza, and all the rest, who are the cold cases that J. Warner Wallace had experience with that he then used to prove the truth of my channel. If you'd like to not line up with the timeline of events, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Not so much that the answers haven't been attempted, but that those answers either don't... God damn it, teleprompter.